We're on chapter 12 of The Path of the Just, the way to acquire nikius or cleanliness, the way to acquire purity or cleanliness. Before we start, let me just say the Ramchal explains in chapter 10 that zerius itself is the first stage of cleanliness or nikius. And it is zerius, and zerius serve as a stepping stone to nikius, or that is watchfulness is zerius. And what's the other one? The first one, zerius is watchfulness, and what was the other one? Zeal, right? Very good. Zerius is zeal. So watchfulness itself is the first stage of purity or cleanliness, and it is zeal that serves as a stepping stone to purity. Okay? Now let's follow through with this, because it's really important to understand. Sometimes we can kind of get caught up in all these terms and get stuck in the weeds on it. So the idea is this: for us to attain purity or cleanliness, I'm trying to think of the proper word, holiness, but cleanliness at the highest level, then the first stage of that is watchfulness. So what we have to do if we want to achieve cleanliness or purity in our life is to begin to develop this attitude of watchfulness, being situationally aware all the time. We learned Monday in the class that this watchfulness is a constant connection to Hashem all the time. It's constantly being aware of Hashem at all times. That's what elevates us from the lower levels into the higher levels. But it is from watchfulness and also zeal that helps us to finally get to the place of cleanliness or purity in our life. What is the zeal and the watchfulness? Well, zeal without watchfulness is dangerous, right? Because you can end up doing something that backfires on you. So you must have watchfulness first. Next, you must have zeal. And zeal is the stepping stones to purity. Now, when we talk about the stepping stones of purity, in the last few weeks in the classes, I've been mentioning the concept of personal prayer. Hitedebut, right? The idea of her personal prayer, hitedebut, right? This idea of intensive, personal prayer to Hashem, talking to Him on a regular basis, every day, 30 minutes, an hour, just sitting alone with Hashem, talking to Him. One cannot even begin to do that if they don't have zeal. And at the same time, that prayer will become almost fruitless if they don't have watchfulness. Because it is in Hitedebut that prayer, you closely examine yourself. It's a very serious internal examination, and that's what the watchfulness is. When one makes a habit in himself with the traits of watchfulness and zeal, thereby attaining basic purity from sin and nurturing his love for Hashem, this will gradually free him from the lure of the physicality and make him strive for spirituality until he attains a complete cleanliness from any improper desire or for a trace of sin, which is in essence nikius. So we understand. I wanted to go back and do a little bit of, past review to make sure that we have in our mind what's going on. Now this chapter 12, is about the way to acquire cleanliness. The true means, according to the Ramchal, by which to acquire the trait of nikius is through constant study of the words of our sages of blessed memory, both in subject of Torah law and the subject of ethical instruction, which is considered musar, right? So consider, after a person has already confirmed for himself the obligation of acquiring nikius and the necessity of mastering its trait, which will come after he has already attained the traits of what? Watchfulness and zeal. By having engaged in the methods of acquiring them, having distanced himself from the factors that detract from them, There will, at this point, no longer remain before him any hindrances to acquire nikius, except for gaining knowledge of the details of the commandments, so that he can be scrupulous in adhering to them all. Men are probably one of the most famous species that never likes to look at instructions, right? We like putting together the TV cabinet and only go digging through the trash to find what the instructions say after it doesn't come out right, right? It's just part of our nature. I don't know what it is. Maybe we think we know it all. I don't know what it is. It's a macho thing, right? But see, it's that same macho attitude that keeps men from having purity in their life and cleanliness. It's the same sort of macho attitude. Well, I can figure it out on my own. But what the Ramchal is saying is that it will be impossible to achieve the upper levels of cleanliness without the study of Torah laws and the study of the sages. Now, you want to study the Torah itself. We study the Torah all the time. We do Torah portion reading. But as you've noticed, what we've done is now in this cycle of the Torah, we're teaching Torah and Musar, right? We're teaching Torah and ethics. How does my soul connect to this portion, right? That's why last night the whole thing of confronting your inner Pharaoh is about really examining deep within ourselves. What does the sages say about our inner Pharaoh? And this is the study of Torah. You might want to include, even though halachically many things do not apply to you, right? Knowing the Torah laws help you put a lot of things in perspective, right? I'm not a mechanic. Just not a mechanic. However, I know enough about a car's symptoms to know what's wrong with the car. How do I know that? Just by pure experience. I never went to school. If I really want somebody to work on the car and fix it properly, then I go to an ASE certified mechanic who knows not only the symptoms, but knows what to do. Why? Because he's studied the detailed text of the auto manuals that show him how to fix that thing. So the reason why that the study of Torah laws, halachic laws, are important. It helps us to get a framework as how to approach many things within the Torah. He goes on and says, therefore, it is absolutely necessary for a person to have a thorough knowledge of Torah laws, to know how far the branches and the subdivisions of the commandments reach. Additionally, since forgetfulness is common with these finer points of mitzvah, he will acquire constant study of the books that clarify these details to continually refresh recollection of them in his mind. Then, when comprehensive knowledge and constant review, with comprehensive knowledge and constant review, he will surely be inspired to fulfill them. In the previous chapter, the Ramchal specified that nikius is necessarily not only for actions and mitzvah, but for character traits, which are called what? Midot. As well, we now address this topic of midot. Now, when we talk about the branches, when the Ramchal mentions the roots and the branches that go deeper, this is what we're talking about, the finer levels of your character trait. I mentioned last night that many of us have the inner Pharaoh that no one ever sees. The citizenry of Egypt didn't see Pharaoh. He stayed in his palace. At night when he wanted to go to the bathroom, he'd go out to the Nile. He didn't want people to think that he was not a deity, right? No one ever saw him. Moshe, however, was called to Bo el Paro, to come to Pharaoh. And Hashem calls us to the finer details, the root, and only we know the root. I don't know the root that you have in your character trait that needs to be tikkun, rectified before Hashem. You don't know mine. Now, we can pray for each other, right, that Hashem would illuminate those finer details that need to be refined, but it is midos that where this lies. So let's look at this. The same is true regarding the cleansing oneself from negative character traits, and we talked about this. In order to acquire this dimension of nikyus, it is essential for the one to read the ethical discourses of earlier or more sages. For example, Pierre Kevot, which is the ethics of the fathers, the works of the Gemara, the works of Rishon, And we go on and on. There are many, many other works that are available that we can study. For many times, even after a person has firmly resolved to be among the meticulous ones to attain the use, it is still possible for him to err in certain details because his knowledge did not encompass them. Indeed, such errors are almost inevitable for a person that is not born wise. It is impossible for him to instinctively know everything. However, through constant study of these matters, one will be awakened to which he did not previously know, and will contemplate that which he did not previously discern, including even that which he will not find in the sacred books themselves. Now, what does he mean by this? By studying the Torah, by studying Torah law, there are some things, because you understand the mechanism of how the decisions are made by the sages and what their thought process is, something new could come into your life, and you would go, you know what? I'm almost sure that this is not appropriate. This is just not something that even though the sages may not have dealt with it. Here's a prime example. We live in a modern time, right? The sages didn't deal with mass media. Now, a lot of the Orthodox rabbis in Israel and even in the United States have nothing to do with the internet, right? I mean, Rabbi Zalman Weiss, who's just now starting to venture out a little bit with Skype, has an email but doesn't know how to check it, right? Right?
He's got that speaking doing his pictures upside down.
Right. So it is. It's funny. Yeah, he's done that. Yeah, he's got his phone turned upside down. So the issue is this. His answer, because it's not addressed by the sages, what do you do with the internet when it's a free flowing of all the worldly information? What do? Shut it down. Don't have anything to do with it. Where does that come from? Why would they do that? Where in the Torah, where do the sages say that this should be the approach for the internet? Pierre Quevot teaches in the Ethics of the Father to build a fence around Torah to avoid even the slightest infraction of the Torah. So what the sages would say is they would read passages such as, I shall not put any evil thing before my eyes, right? And if that be in the case, believe me, the internet can be evil. As much as it can be light, it is dark as well. And the daily assault on our senses is almost overwhelming. The other day I was sitting with my wife and daughter watching TV, and the 3 or 4 commercials that came on, and we were watching like some old 1950s sitcom, innocent, sweet, but the 3 commercials came on in between, assaulted my senses. And I was like, this is ridiculous. And I was embarrassed in front of my wife and daughter to see the commercials. What should be my response? The sages don't talk about that. However, I do know what the Torah talks about and what the sages talking about, guarding my gateways, guarding my eyes. And, do I sit there through the commercial breaks and close my eyes, or do I just leave? But those are the finer details that we can discover if we have the intuition and we do study the Torah laws. For once one's intellect is awakened to the matter of perfecting his character traits, his mind will proceed to pay attention to all the possibilities, and he will produce original ideas for self-improvement. This is what we're talking about, which emanate from the source of truth, the Torah lessons set forth from the works of the sages. Now, let's examine for a moment the factors that take away from this level of cleanliness. The factors that impair this trait are the same as all the factors that impair the traits of watchfulness and zeal, right? So we have, which are the preoccupation of worldly matters, levity, remember these? Cynicism, negative peer pressure, as discussed in chapter 5. And if you're watching, go and you haven't seen chapter 5, stop and go back and see chapter 5. In addition to these, there is also a lack of comprehensive knowledge of Torah laws or ethical instructions, as I have just written, as he was just written. In this vein, the sages of blessed memory have already stated in Mishnah Avos 2:5 An ignorant person cannot be a pious person. And a person is obvious, the person is obvious for one who does not and cannot perform. The reason is obvious. The reason is obvious that one cannot perform them. They also said in Kiddushin 40b, study of Torah is the primary importance because it brings one to the performance of mitzvah. Now let me propose this question or ask this question to you. If a person does not have the capability of doing mitzvahs, nor the mental capacity to study Torah, they may not be pious, but can they have a connection to Hashem? Absolutely. And that's what we're talking about, the whole beauty of personal prayer. One can have an elevated connection to Hashem and do what comes sort of natural in their love for Hashem without the knowledge of Hashem. That's why the Creator, blessed be His name, has provided an avenue for every human being in the world to somehow connect to Him. Baruch Hashem, He's thought about all the details. I can remember when I was living in another previous religious life, and I was always perplexed over the idea, what about all of those who don't believe like me? And what about all of those who didn't believe this before this became the new reality? Right? And you had to always rest back and go, may God have mercy on them, because I guess they're going to hell. And wasn't that a pitiful way to have to view the Creator of the universe? Now that we know Torah, now that we study the sages, we look and go, wow, God, you're so amazing. You figured it out. That's the guy that's lived in the backwoods of this country before Columbus, before anybody ever came, the American Indian could have a connection to Hashem. And there were American Indians that did have a connection with Hashem, believed in one God, believed that one God created the universe, and they had an incredible connection to Hashem. So let's summarize this. Once a person who mastered zerus, which is watchfulness, and zerizus, which is zeal, and has recognized the necessity for cleanliness, he or she will be inspired to acquire this trait, but they must strive to acquire through the knowledge of halakha, details of various mitzvah, and the ethical fine points of the various character traits. This necessitates constant study and review to ensure that he internalizes all the details and does not forget any subtle points. Constant engagement in study will further enable him to perceive even matters that are not found in the sacred text. Baruch Hashem, right? To attain nikayus, one must also avoid the factors that detract from this trait, which is the same as those that detract from zerius. So, in closing, we learn how to acquire this is by a heightened sense of awareness and knowledge of the Torah laws. What is not really said here is something that we understand Kabbalistically, spiritually, that when one engages themselves in the study of Torah and they do tshuva over the things that they discover, they begin to receive a higher awareness, a higher connection to Hashem. They just become more hyper-vigilant about their lives. And the less one studies Torah, and we all know this, I mentioned this to Hashem in prayer the other day. Have you ever gone a couple of days, got busy, went out of town with friends, family, or whatever, and you come back and you feel like a spiritual moron, right? You just feel like you've gotten so dumb spiritually. And it's because you've been in an environment that affected you so much. And that's why this idea that Rabbi Zalman Weiss says that life is like walking the opposite direction on an escalator. If you stop, you're going back down. You're not going up, right? And I said, Hashem, I'm glad that I sensed that, because there was a time in my life I never would have even noticed the slightest change of that. But you get home after being away for just 24 hours. I was with family, and I love my family. They're sweet people. But we were engaged in the most banal conversations. right? About nothing, and it was. I felt I was getting dumber by the minute, right? Because I wanted, and you understand what I mean. I just felt like I was being, like, oh my goodness, just help me, Hashem. I would even walk out of the room and go sit in another room, so at least have some quiet time, so my brain would be cluttered with stuff that just is not that important. It wasn't bad talk. It was just.
They talk about TV programs.
TV programs, how my car run. Yeah. Football. Oh, football, baseball, sports. What's that? All worldly things. And they are the detractors. However, I mean, the ideal thing is if you could do hours of study per day. That's the ideal thing. But most people don't have hours a day to do study. But you do have time. I guarantee you that once you begin to develop watchfulness and zeal, you will have a joy for purity. And therefore, you will make the time to listen to lectures, to when you're in drive time, you don't muddy your mind with useless news or music. You listen to lectures or whatever it may be. And that will build us and take us to the next place of cleanliness, how to acquire cleanliness. The next class will be chapter 13, and it's going to be the trait of abstinence. So it should be really interesting class, chapter 13. That concludes the class. Any questions, comments, commentary?